Scott Pendlebury from the Collingwood Football Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
This is Patrick Crouch from the Carlton Footy Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Max Gorn, Melbourne Football Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Jackson Macrae, one of the big fantasy football player names that changed clubs during the off-season. Is this just one of the easiest picks that we've got this upcoming season, or is there some cause for concern? Regardless, he's super relevant. It's how he's landed at number 5 and why we must talk about him on today's episode of the 50 Most Relevant. Joining me on this podcast, true story. When we spoke about Jackson 12 months ago, I had this man on the guest list. We had him. I felt like we got to run it back again because some of the narrative is still very true that we need to bring back. Jaiden, nice to have you back on the Coaches Panel podcast and welcome back to the 50 Most Relevant.
Thanks, MJ. Yeah, nice to be back. And it is funny, just doing the Macrae episode last year, straight back in this year. I don't think we even really talked about it. I think it was just instant, which is nice. Like, he's a great player to talk about. I love him. And we've definitely, lined it up in a very relevant year.
Yes, we certainly have. There's a reason for it. Jaiden, over the last 12 months, statistically has brought a greater understanding to the community of how a player scores and where they score their points, especially in an AFL fantasy perspective when it comes to breaking it down into stoppage points and transition points. That's going to be something that I'm sure we will get to on today's episode around Jackson Macrae. But if we look back briefly just to last year, not a pretty sight. The positive is it's what helped us pick up forward status. So while we're going to throw some shade potentially at how hard last year was, last year's pain is a new year's gain. Forward status for us, a 71.4 average in AFL Fantasy means he's priced just over 730,000 in AFL Fantasy and a touch under that in Dream Team. While SuperCoach, an almost identical average, a 72.8, means he's priced under 400k. These are price points across these formats we have not seen for a decade from Jackson Macrae. Not many great scores last year, but there was at least one decent game against his now club that he plays for, St Kilda. A 123 in SuperCoach was his highest score last year. That's a way off a career high, which is a 189 against the Suns. And a 129 in fantasy in that same St Kilda game was his top score of the year, and a 190 in SuperCoach. Jaiden, we have seen some trends over the last few years of a declining Macrae, which we will talk about in just a moment. But when we just look back over these seasonal averages and reflect if you've played any form of fantasy AFL over the last 10 years, Jackson Macrae is someone we've looked back and loved owning because he's just pure fantasy about how he gets the ball. He uses the ball pretty well by hand and by foot. He tackles, he's bobs up and kicks the odd goal, but just this incredible endurance work rate about him where he works from contest to contest to contest, gets involved in scoring chains, links up, happy to win a contested footy as well. Just pure fantasy football for the past decade is what Jackson Macrae has been for us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the key to that is just the balance of inside and outside. Like, coming into his career in his second year, like, he was able to average 104 straight off the bat, and it really set up his fantasy prospects for us going forward. And like, he's been the number one scorer in the AFL Fantasy platform since it became the AFL Fantasy platform. Like, he's just always been there, always been relevant. And yeah, in that second year, just 104. But the key to that, he wasn't even really playing midfield at all. He was out on the wing, like inside mid. Only 15% centre bounces in that year. Like, he was just out on the wing, absolutely dominating. 6 marks a game. Like, this is a player that has, or maybe had, a lot of ability to get around the ground, inside and outside, which is why he's so relevant, because we have players that are very contested, very inside, and they are capped at 90. And then we've got wings, so are very outside, and they're capped at 90 as well. For Macrae to be able to go 115, 120 in some years, he's had to unlock both of those, which is why he's so relevant.
We are feeling like we're a little bit away from these years of being 110 and 120. Like, we could look at last year in a vacuum of low 70s across the formats, the one AFL Fantasy ton, the 3 in SuperCoach, just the one 120-plus score across the formats. But so much of last year was volatility in terms of whether he was receiving the vest or not. He had a handful of those last year. And then positionally, for champion data to just hand him pure forward status as well clearly means there's not even that 35% year threshold for them to go, okay, there's enough for him to be a dual position option. It's pure forward that we're sitting here. So he was way outside of this historical lane where he's been, as you mentioned, getting some centre bounce presence, getting some wing presence, and then being able to score both through stoppage and transition. So maybe break down it for us. How has he been getting this scoring from a statistical lens, both from last year and then from more of a career perspective? How and where does he get his points? Because I think that's an important narrative for us as we look forward to injecting him into this St Kilda midfield. Knowing who he is and what he is might just help us have a fair indication of what to expect this coming year.
Yeah, so when it comes to stoppage and transition, the kind of key thing to remember is, like, when I look at the numbers, stoppage is very correlated across the competition. Stoppage points is correlated with midfield time, which is not a massive surprise. But then when you look at the transition stuff, it's a bit more cloudy. There's not really any correlation at all with midfield time, which is fairly important because we're looking at a player that has the ability to score in transition, and he can get around the ground. He's a good runner and stuff like that. So we're looking at transition points from a age perspective. We're looking at it from a work rate and player style. We know the best players in the comp and what they do in transition. Like, you think about Errol Goulden, players like that. Like, that's completely on them. It's not really to do with that role at all. So from a stoppage perspective, it's pretty clear what's happened with Macrae. So last year, only about 30 points from stoppages, which is quite low. Like, we're looking at midfielders who go full-time, midfielders who go 50, 55, and the top in the comp go 60, like Caleb Sarong. He's only going at 29, which makes a bit of sense. Like, as you said, champion data didn't even have him at 30% midfield time. So, yeah, he was going quite low, which is by far his lowest over the last 8 years or so. So if I look at what he's done at stoppage in the past, he's been kind of that 70% centre bounce guy about 5 years ago. And he used to do 50, 55 stoppage points per game, which is what you'd probably expect for a player in that prime. Even though stoppage scoring was a lot higher back in the day. And we've seen that drop off with the midfielders recently. So I'm thinking, like, for him, he's probably getting closer to that 45 stoppage points kind of guy, which is pretty good. Like, that's 15 points better than what he did last year. Mm. And then if we go over to the transition stuff, this is his strength. Like, this is really where he comes into light. For him to average 122 123 even in 2018, he had to do 67 points in transition, which is pretty enormous for a player who was playing midfield, inside midfield at the time as well. Like, we've got players that can do that at the moment, but these are guys like Flanders, who spent half the year at half back. Goulden, who's pretty much a predominant winger. He did this in a year where he was pretty much fully inside mid, and really the only player that compares to him is Zach Merritt. And that's really no surprise, as those are the two most relevant players over the last decade. So in 2018, career high of 67 points in transition. And unfortunately, that was his peak. And he's slowly declined every year since, which kind of makes sense. We're not looking at a metric that matters so much about midfield time. It's more to do with his age, his ability to run, something to do with game style, and also his player ability style as well. He's obviously always had this ability, but it has slowly declined. So last year, only 42 points in transition, but yeah, some of those affected by subs. And I think that's probably about where he's at.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we make these comments around players getting bevoed from the Western Bulldogs, and while I understand it's all in jest, or at least the intent is meant to be it's in jest, it is clearly this is a coach and a side that they've won grand finals within the past decade. They've made an additional one and been regularly in and around the finals race, and such an elite midfield group, and yet we discount professionals, us in our 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, however old you are watching or listening to this podcast, go, oh, he just got bevoed. The coach has no idea what he's doing with Jackson Macrae. And while I hear the playfulness in that commentary, we sometimes then allow that to infect our view and our lens on a player. So it's not really for us to know exactly what was the causation of him to fade out of this starting midfield core. The benefit is he is in a new system, but it might just mean we do need to temper some expectations here, because are we seeing a limited upcoming output when it comes to Jackson Macrae? Is it enough reason to fade starting him? Well, we'll talk about that. But I just find it really intriguing to me that we go, Bevo was the reason Macrae was not a 110 guy. But we've seen this trend fall away of his scoring from stoppage, his scoring from transition, whether he's got that work rate in him anymore as he does get towards the tail of his career. It's an impossible question to ask you, Jaiden, but I do want to get your comments on it, maybe from a statistical lens rather than sitting inside the four walls of the Bulldogs. Is there anything that you can see that, from a data point, gives us some indication of why Beveridge may have faded him out? And it might not be about Macrae specifically, but about the Dogs' game style, the mix of what that midfield is. Is there anything statistically that is a thread we could pull to give us some understanding beyond he just got bevoed?
Yeah, the Dogs have really been blessed with that talent in the midfield over the last very while, like 5 years in specifics. Like, it should be pretty simple, right? We've got like Bond, we've got Livard, Treloar, Smith, Daniel, Macrae, Dunkley, Richards. Oh, and we can't drop Sanders either. So give them all 90% CBAs and we'll all be happy. So I think all fantasy coaches have it completely understood. Like, it's not that hard, surely. I'm obviously kidding, but I think for Macrae, like, something that is pretty relevant is that transition drop-off. Because that's pretty much down to his ability to spread around the ground. And if they have so many other midfielders that can do well inside, and Macrae's strength has always been outside play. Not saying that he needs to go to half forward, but if that transition stuff is dropping away, maybe that inclines that he is fading. It's not really to do with the role, because that's navigated in the stoppage points area. The transition stuff is dropping away each year, so that could be part of it. But I remember last year during this episode, one of the key things was the impact of Adam Treloar, and that clearance numbers, that scoring is absolutely correlated with one another since Treloar's come over. And it's really interesting to know, because like, if Treloar's going better, it means Macrae goes down. And in games where Macrae went really well, it's because Treloar was down. It makes it a fascinating hindsight call about why Treloar was M1 last year. Like, Macrae completely out of there, and it really opened up Treloar. So that's part of it as well. Obviously, the Collingwood salary cap kind of forced that move, and I think that could be a real reason for it as well, which is why it's quite exciting for him to find a fresh team.
Yeah, well, we look at him now at St Kilda, and it's always got an element of risk when we try to interject a player, their game style, and just presume that they'll glide seamlessly in. But it does feel quite easy to build the narrative and understandable when you take the type of player that Macrae is, the midfield void that exists in this side. Like, it's Jack Steele and with Philippou injured, then who? Sinclair seemingly, the narrative coming out of the club is the distributor off half-back, that it is his role, and maybe with a little bit of spurts through centre bounce and through the wing. Windhager's the more defensive-minded mid. Travalia, maybe we'll see an opportunity. And then we're starting to hit names that people just don't want to talk about, like Jones and Doubt. Like, this is not a strong or deep midfield. So, one, he does move straight into almost that number 2 midfield spot behind Steele, especially with the injury to Philippou. So there's one upside. And then you mentioned, like, transition scoring is where he has built his game. Well, last year, just in AFL Fantasy, St Kilda were 4th overall for points. They're number 2 in the league for kicks. They're top 5 for possessions. They're number 2 for marks. And players like Sinclair, Nazai, Wanganeen Miller, even a Mason Wood, like, these guys scoring through transition is super duper high. And so if Macrae hasn't lost that work rate, and that is his weapon, work rate is what gets him to these contests. His ability to not stop running, while he's not elite at any one specific thing outside of it, he's so elite historically in work rate that gets him to where the ball is more regularly than almost anybody else. And so the enjoyable appetite for the community feels like it's bubbling into overflow territories, Jaiden, because you take this breakdown of stoppage and transition that's historical into a team that move the ball so heavily through kick mark. There is a world where we could see, while maybe not a return to his peak, he could be knocking on that door not too far away.
Love, exciting and new. Hello, Hannah Waddingham here. Have you seen the fabulous new Sun Princess? World-class entertainment, exceptional dining, and the greatest pizza ever. It's a love.
Don't miss our Come Aboard sale with up to 40% off and free room upgrades. Visit princess.com or call your travel advisor to book. Princess Cruises. Terms and restrictions apply. Offer ends 2/28/25. Ships at Bermudan and British Registry.
Sergeant and Mr. Smith, you're gonna love this house.
Bunk beds in a closet?
There's no field manual for finding the right home. But when you do, USAA Homeowners Insurance can help protect it the right way. Restrictions apply.
Yeah, of all the clubs that you could pick for Macrae to go to, I think like St Kilda is very close to being that obvious number 1 option. Like you've put it there. It's just the transition stuff that excites me the most. Over the last 8 years, I've got transition and stoppage data, and St Kilda in 2023 and in 2024, both of those were top 5 seasons for transition scoring. So it's a really conducive environment for scoring transition, and it's quite surprising because even players like Jack Steele last year, like he's gone at 106 last year, 62. Am I reading that right? 62 of those came from transition. That's absolutely ginormous for a player like him. He only did 44 at stoppage last year. Like, this is a player that, you know, we associate with being contested, and he's pretty much finished behind Merritt, Anderson and Dunkley as the next best mid for transition scoring last year. Inside mid, that is. And, like, that's what really excites me about Macrae. Like, his transition drop-off has been pretty clear. Like, every single year he's taken off 2, 3, even sometimes up to 5 points off that peak in 2018. So he's going now to a club that is so heavily transition-based, and that can partially be down to the Marvel Stadium effect, but when you're playing at Marvel, there's also a lot of other teams that are very good at transition and aren't restrictive at all. Like, you think about North Melbourne playing there. So that's pretty helpful. And St Kilda just love to score. So it makes it really exciting for him to go there. And then, like you said, the inside midfield mix at St Kilda, like, it's just a very obvious fit there with what's going on. Philippou injured now, makes me a lot more keen on Macrae in draft. I just think it's really exciting prospect. And I think he can kind of reverse some of that decline that he's had over the past few years in transition, just because of the fact that he's such a good transition scoring team, even better than the Dogs have been.
There's such undeniable ease of excitement pathways for us here. We look at a player that fell out of that midfield rotation, both through centre bounce and transition outcomes, and plonked forward. So now we've got a pure value forward with historical pedigree of, look, close to nearly 50 points of upside. Well, I don't think anyone should have that level of expectation. All he needs to do is a 15 to 20 points per game of upside, and he returns undeniable value. And that's only into the mid to low 90s. So that's an amazing ease of narrative for how he gets there through some more midfield time. We've got a real lack of top-end forwards, probably outside of Horn, Francis. I don't see anybody starting with an F1 that they feel is near their top price. And then again, just a few days ago, we did the episode on the Hornet with Hef. There is a narrative and pathway to scoring upside for him, but you take a low threshold of what it needs to get near premium territories, an ease of back into this midfield, a high scoring transition ecosystem that he's landing in. It does become a hard player to go against, and it's why so much of the community, when they put all those things, and we talked a lot throughout this series of stacking up decisions and the variables that stack up to inform outcomes, like all those things, you put it together, it's understandable why he's in 57% at time of recording of AFL fantasy teams, and pretty similar sort of trends in Dream Team and SuperCoach. I think it's sort of 54 to 61% ownership across those formats, so highly owned. Is there a world for you, Jaiden, where you see it's worth taking the risk and fading him? I know ownership can inform a decision to whether fade or start a player, but when you throw his ownership and these outcomes that we've talked through, or potential inputs, rather, should I say, that could deliver a positive outcome, is there a narrative reason for where you feel fading Macrae feels valid to you, or is that just adding a risk profile to your starting squad you want no part of?
My take on ownership has kind of changed a little bit over the last while. More so down to the fact that, like, if you're chasing very high success in the fantasy format, you can just lock and load all the highly owned picks. That's a way to go about it. But you could also get to a point, and I think it's more to do with how the early buys have come in. You can get to a point where a player is so highly owned that you kind of almost have to go against them. I don't think that's the case here with players that don't have the early buy, but you know, if someone gets to such a high ownership and they did have an early buy, you kind of get to the point where you do have to fade them. I find that very hard to apply to Macrae without the early buy, but also just like if I look at what I've got for his worthwhile average based on the last 10 years of what we've seen in fantasy, like he only needs to go at a 92.5 to be a smash pick. I struggle to see a world where he doesn't go 90, and the main reason for that is the stoppage stuff. Like if you just bump up his midfield time to what he used to get, even if that's only 65%, like I can't see where he doesn't go 45 points from stoppage. I just find that really hard to see how that doesn't happen, because he's basically done that at a minimum. Even in 2023, when he only started in the centre bounce 36% of the time, like he was still doing 44 points from stoppage. So I find it very hard to say he can't go at 45 at stoppage. So that's half of it. And then we look to the other half in transition. Like even last year, he still did 42, included with sub games in that, in transition. So he's still got the transition stuff. It's declined from his peak, but he can go 45 at a minimum because he's playing on the best team in the comp for transition scoring. And he's such a great transition player. So that's 45 points again. So there's his 90 straight away. Like I just struggle to see where he can't average 90, which is all he needs.
I'm big on taking on players when it's the right risk profile. But to me, what are you banking against for him? I think ultimately we'll get a look and see at some practice matches and ultimately the community series over the next week or two. But to me, unless he has an unforeseen role adjustment, remembering the club recruited him for a purpose, and now with the Philippou injury, that's been even further accentuated. To me, when you're adding a fade option in your team, it is a calculated risk that you are confident that the narrative will favour you and not everywhere else. I feel like the risk profile's too high when you take these elements that statistically Jaiden has broken down for us, the low scoring threshold of what we require a top end forward to deliver for us, the ecosystem he finds himself in, and just the price point and ownership. Like, this is a lot of risk that you're adding into your teams. And if you are risk averse, like you're like, I don't want to get my hands on an Adam Chera because his hamstrings are risky, so I won't go there. Oh, I'll fade Macrae though. To me, this is a greater risk than of a player being injured. This is the risk I don't want to go against. So to me, I really strongly find it hard to advocate against starting Macrae. The bigger question is, can you start him at F1 or not? And are you happy to fade the likes of the Dylan Moores, the Isaac Rankins, the Horn Francis, who we spoke about most recently? How confident are you, Jaiden? Again, it's 29 in AFL Fantasy, 30 other variables in SuperCoach and Dream Team. But do you feel happy enough with the value that sits in our sides, the way teams are building? Are you comfortable and happy enough to put Jackson Macrae at F1? Or do you think that this selection needs a little bit of extra protection and let him slide to F2?
Yeah, I don't see why not. It's more to me about like a player-by-player basis. Like, I want to come up with an idea of what each player can go at. And then if you end up solving your team of maximising that, then is an F1 really needing to be ginormous? Like, this year is the worst year for forwards based on what the average score is across the forward line. Like, we thought last year was pretty bad, but we still had Flanders there. And they ended up completely fine. But this year's a little bit lower as well. So, like, we don't massively need to go, we have to have an F1 to protect Macrae, I don't think, because I just like to think of it on a player-by-player basis. Like, you can build your squad structure, and obviously rookies will come into play. I'm completely confident to have Macrae F1, just because I don't know if there's a massive amount of upside for the others, but that's nothing to do with Macrae, in my opinion. Like, I'm just looking at Macrae in isolation. He's going to be completely fine. It's more about whether you need an F1, like whether you want to spend up there or not. In a year where the forwards are so cheap, cheaper than they've ever been, from a price stat perspective, do we really need to spend up? Like, we could probably find top 6 forwards cheaper than we could ever find them. Yeah, it's really true. Where he goes on draft day has probably elevated in the last handful of weeks since the injury of Matthias Philippou. And where he goes, I'm very intrigued to get your take. I know, Jaiden, behind the scenes, you've been very busy in some draft platforms and getting a good look at some, not just some average draft selections, but a sense of where and how people in the community are drafting. Where are you happy to take him, and is he in your top tier of forwards? Yeah, he's in my top tier. And over the last few weeks, I guess, doing a lot of drafts, I've gotten more and more comfortable with the idea of Macrae. Just happy to pick him, like for the reasons I've mentioned. Like, I just can't see from his style of play how he can't tick off the 45 points in stoppage, tick off the 45 points in transition, and go the 90 that we need. I'm more than happy to bank that in, which is quite nice, because I do feel there's a bit more hype around the players that are younger. They've got a bit more social media presence, perhaps. Like, those are the ones getting picked in the same kind of bracket as him. So I'm more than happy to take him right there at F1, and I've become more and more confident in that, doing a lot of drafts. It just feels right to me.
Yeah, look, he could be a first rounder if there's a couple of variables that go your way, and it's mostly due to league sizes and on-field demand. Those would be the reasons I'd feel happy to at least support that decision should a coach go that way. It's much more likely to be second, third round as coaches start to either lock away a captaincy option in that first round or just a clear top line 105, 110 SuperCoach territories. We're talking 120 player. But he's going to be one of the first forwards off the ball. For many, it's going to be in a SuperCoach, it's probably a dilemma of is it Smith, is it Horne-Francis, is it Macrae? And it's probably a similar 3 in AFL scoring platforms as well. So he's definitely a top tier forward for me. How early you go really depends on those variables of how many league coaches are you battling against and what is the number of on-field demand. That informs whether you're not reaching, you're accelerating, locking in a top line forward, because it's basically, and Jaiden, you and I know this, even doing a draft together. True story. Once we finish this draft, he's almost going to be on the clock to pick it. It's more of a keeper than it is a single season. But even just in those first 4 or 5 rounds, forwards, you've got to commit to one early, or you're basically happy to just pick a scattering of the 70s and 80s guys. Because if you don't get a top end forward early, you can pretty much kiss one goodbye.
Yeah, it's a difficult thing for me because I do like to fade the forwards, I guess, especially in years when we don't have many. I think there are clear options this year, but there's probably ones that aren't that far away in terms of what they could average. So yeah, I do like to, maybe hold back a bit on the forwards. And I think in our draft right now, I'm not looking the best, but hopefully we can fill up the forwards. And I think you haven't even taken one at all. So, so yeah, I think you can probably pick Macrae with confidence. I'd lean to maybe dropping him down a tier in SuperCoach compared to the other players like Francis, Rankin even, and Bailey Smith. And part of the reason for that is, we've talked so much on this pod about St Kilda's ability to score. And what that means in SuperCoach is they have to get brought down to the 3,300 more than any other club in the comp. And you've got players like Horne-Francis who play for Port who are restrictive. They don't have the best fantasy scorers. They all get brought up, which is why Butters is he goes from being the 20th best mid in AF to number 2 in SuperCoach. It's a 5-point swing if you're on St Kilda compared to Port. So I'm a bit more confident to pick Horne-Francis over there and maybe some other options because St Kilda are just such a high-scoring team and there are teams with other options that do get brought up to that 3,300 instead, and it can be a 5-point swing just from that alone.
Yeah, it's true, man. Hey, you've been an absolute star, not only on this episode, but the work you're doing in and around the community at the moment. We're so appreciative of it. Where can we get in touch with you across social media? And I believe the Stats by Jaiden website's got a few things that are about to drop.
Yeah, definitely. I'm looking to upgrade the kind of in-season stuff that I'm doing, which I think is pretty important. It feels like a bit of a bottleneck. We've got a lot of information. We get to pre-season, round 1 starts, and then it opens up again, and we've got a whole bunch of other stuff to talk about. So I'm going to focus a lot on the in-season stuff this year, projections, stuff like that, fixture analysis. I think there's a lot of room to grow there. So if you're keen to check that out, keep an eye on the site as we get closer to the season, and I'll have some information about, what I'll be putting up there. And it helps me out having a website because then I can view it on my phone whenever. So hopefully you guys can get some use out of it as well.
Yeah, we've put the link for that and where you can get in touch with Jaiden on X inside the description of this episode, mate. We appreciate all you're doing for the community. I'm sure it won't be the last time during this 2025 year we chat on the podcast, mate. So looking forward to chatting again real soon.
Thanks, MJ, and it's a great player to talk about. I'd be happy to talk about him again next year, but I doubt he'll have forward status, so probably could be the first year in a long time he's not relevant.
Yeah, it's very, very true. If you want to go back and listen to any of the other players from this year's edition of the 50 Most Relevant, you can. We're dropping videos every single day, including this one. And if you are watching this on YouTube and you haven't subscribed and given the video a like, why don't you do it now? It'll take a few seconds. The video can still keep rolling, but it does make a huge difference for us. And comment below, what do you predict his average is going to be in 2025? There's audio podcasts dropping daily as well. If you haven't subscribed to the channel to make sure it gets straight into your podcast feed, friend, you got to do it. And give us a 5-star rating. A simple 2-second task makes a huge impact for us here at the Coaches Panel. Inside the description of this episode are not only the website links for the Stats by Jaiden website, the link to get in touch with him on X, but also to reach out to us across social media, get your hands on some Coaches Panel merch, and also to become part of our Patreon. They are getting some great exclusive content that is rolling their way, and a community that are there to help and support each other. If you want to become a Patreon, there is a tier that is right for you. All the links in the description of this episode. And then there were 4. That's it. There's just 4 players left to go. There's a couple of forwards, a ruck, and a defender. The names you know, the order you do not. And so let's give a clue that will at least knock out 2 options for you. I'll give you a 50-50 guess. This is a player that is traded from the Western Bulldogs in the off-season. I told you I'd narrow it down to 2 for you. He's in a team now that has recruited him for a purpose. And he's shown in the purpose that he has been recruited for, he's a premium in that line. And he's coming in undeniable value. But who am I talking about? Because let's be honest, you're getting annoyed at me now. You're going, MJ, that works for both Bailey Smith and Caleb Daniel. I know, that's the point. So which of the former Dogs are we talking about tomorrow? You will find out on the 50 Most Relevant in 24 hours' time.